Shortly after I experienced a miscarriage, Albert took the eggs in the basket to assist Morana once more. It was at that moment I calmly brought up the topic of divorce for the first time. He appeared caught off guard, stammering, "Isolde, there will be more eggs. I promise I won't give them away again." I simply shook my head. "This isn't about the eggs. It's about every instance you've disregarded me, knowing I was leaving this household." Our 2 children were already eager to start calling Morana Mom. I smiled faintly, dragging my frail body as I determinedly set off for Nanchang. I no longer desired a husband or children. A decade later, I had gained nationwide recognition, while the 2 children, now with graying hair, stood beside Albert, looking up at me on the television. It was deep winter, and Albert opened the door, allowing the frigid air to enter and send a chill through me. "I'd like some hot egg drop soup," I said. Albert closed the door, hesitated, and then smirked, asking, "Are you hungry? I'll heat up some porridge for you." I closed my eyes, letting my emotions swirl. Albert wasn't stingy, in fact. He was generous, particularly with Morana, his childhood friend. I had just emerged from the painful memories of my previous life, genuinely wanting to build a happy home. After my miscarriage, I needed nourishment. Albert remained silent for a moment before replying, "Isolde, be good. Tomorrow, I'll buy some eggs to help you recover." I gave him a weary smile, my pale face showing the toll. "There's no need," I responded. "We already have eggs at home." The 2 of us silently battled for a while, but Albert eventually gave in, lowering his head. "Isolde, I gave the eggs away. You know, Pino is still young and growing. Morana is raising a child alone." I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. Looking at Albert, I could already see him as his future 53-year-old self. I realized that the man I had spent my entire life waiting for had finally let go. "You're right. Let's get a divorce." The basket Albert was holding dropped to the floor with a thud, and he froze. For the first time, he felt uneasy because of something I'd said. Still, he assumed it was mere jealousy on my part and muttered an apology. "I'm sorry, Isolde. I didn't realize you were so upset about all this. It won't happen again." I turned away, showing him only my thin, fragile back. There was no room for negotiation now. In my previous life, I had worn myself out, constantly worrying until I died at 54. That life had been filled with bitterness and helplessness. I devoted myself entirely to this family, fighting and fretting over Albert's ambiguous relationship with Isla. But instead of solving anything, I felt like an invisible barrier between the 2 of them, pushing them closer together. When I endured a difficult childbirth and nearly died, Albert was at the amusement park with Morana. After risking my life to deliver twins for Albert, the doctor told me my body was damaged, and I could no longer have children. As I looked at the 2 tiny kitten-like babies on the bed, I wept, feeling that having these 2 was enough. When Albert finally arrived, he peeled an apple for me and apologized, saying, "Sorry, Isolde, I didn't know you'd give birth prematurely. I promised Morana a trip to the amusement park last week, so I couldn't cancel. You understand, don't you?" I stared at him for a long time, and eventually, he lowered his head in guilt. Albert was a man who couldn't grasp what truly mattered. Or perhaps it was just that he didn't love me. When Morana wasn't in the picture, he did show care and affection towards me. But as soon as she reappeared, that faded. In this futile marriage, I shifted all my attention to raising our children. I worked hard to care for them, unaware of how critical a father's influence is in a family. The children mirrored Albert's indifference toward me, bonding with the gentle Marana instead, one by one calling her Mom. It was as though my heart had a giant hole, with something precious continually slipping away. Marana maintained her sweet, nurturing image, patting the children's heads and telling me, "Isolde, these children resemble their father. They both like me." At that moment, I felt utterly defeated, both as a wife and a mother. When I got home, I sternly forbade the children from disrespecting me. Kaya angrily retorted, "I prefer Mom Marana. She's beautiful, smells nice, and is so gentle. Nothing like you." Of course, Marana never had to cook for herself, as Albert happily did it for her, or took half of my food to give to her. If I looked displeased, he'd feel guilty and apologize, assuring me that Marana was just like a sister to him, urging me not to be petty. I worked tirelessly for this family. But Marana, who never lifted a finger, was the one who was always fresh and radiant. She had a man who adored her, and a daughter who sided with her. So naturally, her temperament remained sweet. But what did I have? Even Orion hid behind his father, shouting at me, "We're ashamed to have you as our mother. You don't love us. You only want to keep Dad around." I couldn't control myself and grabbed a broom, my face streaked with tears and snot. "Ungrateful brats! Even Marana's farts must smell nice to you," I yelled. "In that case, give me back your lives. Let's pretend I never gave birth to you." Albert quickly intervened, not wanting to provoke me further. Amid the chaos, I hit him with the broom a few times, and he finally said, "Isolde, they're just kids. They don't mean what they say. Don't take it to heart." But Orion now, in his teenage years, couldn't bear to watch his father get hurt, and suddenly pushed me, causing me to fall hard on the floor. "Dizzy," I heard him shout. "I don't consider you my mother." His words shattered the last defense I had. I watched him storm out, and Albert's voice echoed with frustration. "How long are you going to make a scene every day?" Albert ran after Orion, and Kaya coldly looked at me, declaring, "From now on, I won't call you Mom anymore." At dawn, I wiped away my tears, feeling a sharp pain in my lower abdomen, as though a knife was stabbing me. I touched my empty stomach and forced myself to get up to cook. When I reached the kitchen, I saw Kaya and Orion hurriedly reheating leftovers. As soon as they noticed me, they protectively pulled their bowls closer, unwilling to share. I walked over to the stove and made myself some simple lard noodles, added a few slices of bacon, and threw in some vegetables to get by and satisfy my hunger. The good times for my two children were now in the past. They had once been treated like delicate treasures, never lifting a finger or learning to cook. But in these times, children in most families had to contribute to household chores, and some families even denied their daughters an education. Albert's family wasn't wealthy, and I often had to help cover our expenses. I worked in a cotton mill, watching over several machines, and walked more than 10 kilometers every day. My feet swelled up from the long hours, and for all my effort, I earned only 13 a month. Albert, being a teacher, was one of the most respected people in the village, and he earned 161 a month, which was a decent income. If we both worked together, our household could have lived comfortably. But Albert's wages never stayed with him. Most of it went straight to Morgana, who couldn't support herself. My husband didn't understand the cost of daily living, And my children, who were spoiled and wasteful, only added to my burden. It was my hard work alone that kept Albert's family afloat. I heard footsteps outside, and Albert walked in asking, "Asulta, why are you out of bed? You need to rest, or you'll make yourself sick." I didn't reply. Cass Aya pulled Albert to sit down and eat. The room fell into silence, with only the sound of chewing breaking the quiet. Orion stood up, saying, "I'm full, I'm going to school." He waited for Cass Aya, who glanced at me, waiting for me to pour hot water into their cups. Cass Aya, wiping her mouth and grabbing her school bag, followed her brother out. They said goodbye to Albert, but Orion, irritated by my silence, kicked the chair on his way out. Albert frowned, asking why my temper was so bad. Cass Aya suddenly remembered their water cups. Albert responded lightly, "Go fill the cups and hurry to school. You'll be late." When I didn't move, Cass Aya grudgingly went to fill the hot water herself. In her rush, the kettle fell, spilling boiling water everywhere, soaking a large part of her cotton pants. Albert rushed over in concern, lifting her pant leg to check the damage, while Orion ran back inside, scolding her for being so careless. I finished my meal, the chair scraping against the floor as I stood. Cass Aya looked at me with teary, resentful eyes. I simply told her, "Go to the hospital." She stared at me, tears rolling down her cheeks, feeling as if something had quietly shifted. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, when a similar burn would have sent me running to her side, cradling her in my arms and rushing to the clinic. I would cry and fret over her, terrified she'd be scarred. But today, I was distant, cold even. She couldn't understand how I could be so indifferent. I was her mother. Back in my room, I dug out my private savings. Over the years, I had made a habit of setting aside a little money each month just in case an emergency happened. I carefully counted the amount. It came to 3,231 with some loose change. This money would be the foundation of my new life. I was determined to only spend it on myself. Once I fully recovered, I would leave Albert and this home behind for good. When I woke up around noon, Albert had surprisingly cooked a meal, something he hadn't done in ages. There were 5 dishes and a soup. Orion was applying medicine to Cass Aya again. As Albert put the soup on the table, he accidentally touched the hot pot, rubbing his ear awkwardly and smiling at me. "I just finished. I wanted you to rest more, so I didn't call you for dinner earlier." I nodded and thanked him. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, and said, "There's no need for thanks between us. We're husband and wife." I didn't respond. As soon as I sat down, I heard Orion complaining. "All you do is take it easy, not even caring when your own daughter gets hurt. And you still let Dad, who's been busy all day, cook." I sneered at him. "Do I owe you something?" Cass Aya, her eyes full of tears again, muttered, "We don't like you." Albert slammed his hand on the table, standing up angrily. "How can you speak to your mother like that? Haven't you learned anything from all your reading?" Cass Aya and Orion fell silent. I laughed dryly and told them, "You don't have to like me, because soon I won't have anything to do with you." My words startled them all, leaving them confused and scared. What did I mean by saying we'd have no connection soon? Just then, a timid voice from the doorway interrupted the tense moment. "Albert, I came to see Cass Aya." I turned to see Morgana, dressed in a pink wool coat, her fair skin glowing. She held a little girl by her side who looked as sweet as a doll. Isolde, may I come in? She asked nervously. I didn't respond, too focused on my food to deal with such trivial matters. Albert, embarrassed, welcomed her in. Of course, don't worry about it. Your sister-in-law isn't feeling well. Come on in. Morgana's daughter, Pinot, ran toward Albert, who lifted her into his arms. Pinot, sweetheart, have you eaten? She shook her head, pouting. No, Mom and I were waiting for Uncle. Sister Cass Aya and Brother Orion to come over and cook. Albert affectionately stroked her hair. Go eat at the table, and if you can't reach the food, ask your aunt to help you. Pinot obediently climbed onto a stool, eyeing me with suspicion. On the other side of the room, Morgana quietly shed tears as she gazed at Cass Aya's injury. Cass Aya, you must be more careful. Girls can't afford to get scars, and you'll need to avoid certain foods while you're healing. Cass Aya, playing her part, sobbed softly. Mum is too busy to take care of me. Dad even had to cook today. Orion scoffed. She just said she doesn't want anything to do with us. From now on, Morgana will be our mum. Morgana glanced awkwardly at Albert, unsure of how to respond. I stayed silent, continuing to eat without reacting. Anger simmered within Albert. He slapped Orion on the back of the head. Don't talk nonsense! Orion, defiant, glared back. What did I say wrong? Why are you hitting me? Albert raised his hand again, but before he could strike, I slammed my bowl down and yanked Pinot off her stool. She let out a piercing wail, and Morgana rushed over to take her back. What are you doing, Isolde? How can you treat a child like that? I gripped Pinot's collar tightly as they cried, demanding an apology. Albert rushed over, trying to free my hands. Why are you taking your anger out on a child, Arthur? He asked. I opened my hand, revealing a large patch of blood and a broken nail lying there. Almost losing control, I shouted, Say sorry! Marana hurried over, shouting, You're scaring my daughter. Albert grabbed my wrist in panic. Acela, are you hurt? Let's talk calmly, okay? Cass Aya suddenly yelled, Her foot is injured. Albert's eyes dropped to my blood-soaked shoes. Ignoring my struggles, he scooped me up and carried me into the room. Marana, now cradling Pinot, who was still sobbing, quickly left. Cass Aya made a move to follow, but Orion stopped her, saying, Stay here, you're hurt too. I'll check on her. I thrashed against Albert, but he held me firmly, guilt written across his face. I'm sorry, Isa. Pinot's just a child. I promise I'll talk to her, but let's treat your injury first. I spat at him, enraged. Go to hell. It's not you who's hurt. Albert quietly removed my blood-soaked shoes and hesitated. I'm sorry, he repeated. I broke down in tears, feeling utterly drained. No one in this family has ever treated me fairly, I whispered through gritted teeth. Orion, standing silently at the door, handed over the alcohol. Albert had always been seen as the reasonable one, while I had been labelled the unruly, hot-tempered one. They called me a troublemaker, saying I couldn't bear any slight. They spread stories about how I once sat outside old Jiang's house for half a day with a knife, shouting after an argument, scaring everyone away. They gossiped about me blocking Morgana's path with a broom out of jealousy because Albert talked to her too much. But I wasn't always this fierce. I had dreams of being loved and cared for when I was young. When the matchmaker introduced me to Albert, she painted a picture of him as an educated youth who would soon return to the city for a prestigious office job. I fell for him quickly. He was charming in our early days, romantic even. He'd take me to lie under the stars, hold my hand, and tell me childhood stories. He'd race me around the reservoir on his bike, making me cling tightly to him. He knew all my likes and dislikes, and would buy me anything I glanced at twice in the market. Our married life was sweet. He handed over his salary, showering me with affection. I loved him deeply and willingly had his children. But all that changed the day Morgana entered our lives. His love for me faded, replaced by a sense of obligation. Whenever my needs clashed with Morgana's, I was the one who had to compromise. Even our children learned to disregard me, following Albert's example. In my past life, I died alone from a cerebral hemorrhage on New Year's Eve, while Albert and the kids celebrated with Morgana. I won't let that happen again. Later that evening, Morgana came over with teary eyes and gifts, apologizing for Pino's behavior. "I'm so sorry, Albert." Pino saw the nail under Aselda's foot and wanted to pick it up before she stepped on it. "Please forgive us." Albert pushed away the gifts, saying, "No one wants this to happen. Pino is just a child. Isolde will understand." I couldn't hold back anymore. Rushing out, I yelled, "Stop your fake tears, Morgana. It's sickening. Albert, why do I always have to make way for Morgana and her daughter in everything? Why do you insist on being kind on my behalf?" My anger only grew as I spotted the swill bucket at the door. I grabbed it and threw the dirty water at the pair. Albert instinctively shielded Morgana, taking the brunt of the splash. Morgana screamed in shock, drenched head to toe. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. Albert, clearly embarrassed, turned to me and said, "Are you satisfied now? If you're angry, take it out on me. Morgana's done nothing wrong." I hurled the bucket at him, and though he didn't move, it hit him hard, leaving a bump on his forehead. Morgana screamed again and rushed to check on him. "Aselda, how can you be so cruel?" she wailed. Ignoring her, I grabbed a stick near the door and stormed towards Morgana. She panicked, backing away quickly. "Albert, stop her! She's gone mad!" she cried. Albert stepped in, grabbing the other end of the stick. "Let go!" I glared at him, but he just shook his head, his eyes red with emotion. "Asela, you're unwell. Don't hurt others. If you need to, hit me instead." Unable to pull the stick away, I could only glare at him. "Go home, Morgana," Albert said firmly. "From now on, we should keep our distance." Morgana looked stunned, but seeing my fury, she fled in a hurry. When she was out of sight, Albert let go of the stick. The sudden release of tension caused it to hit him on the neck, and he groaned in pain. Despite this, he smiled gently at me. "Asela," he said softly, "we have money. We can see a doctor." I tossed the stick aside, looking at him. "I'll be fine once I leave this house, Albert. I used to hate you, but now I don't have the strength to care anymore." I walked back inside, leaving Albert standing there, his steps unusually heavy. He wanted to reach out and stop me, to talk things through, but it was as if he was rooted in place. He cursed himself under his breath, tears spilling down his cheeks. Later that evening, Orion announced, "I got first place in the town." The teacher asked me to bring my parents to accept the award tomorrow. Albert, proud, patted Orion's shoulder. "Well done. You've made us proud." Cass Aya smiled too, saying, "I'll learn from my brother." Orion's hopeful eyes turned to me, but I just put down my bowl and stood up to leave. His face darkened. "If you don't want to go, I'll ask Aunt Morgana instead," he said bitterly. I finally gave him a cold glance. Do as you wish. Albert slapped the back of Orion's head. Don't speak to your mother like that. Morgana is an outsider. Orion retorted. I didn't ask her, but look, she doesn't care. Albert sighed. I'll talk to her later. But I just shut the door and sat alone, mending shoes. I couldn't understand what had gotten into them in this life. Orion didn't bother to inform me. He secretly contacted Albert and Morgana. I only found out through one of Orion's classmates. Excited, I hurriedly removed my factory uniform and rushed home to change into a nearly new bright red dress. I was afraid I wouldn't make it to Orion's award ceremony on time, and that he would blame me, his mother, for not taking it seriously. I rode in a bumpy ox cart, feeling nauseous. But when I arrived in a rush, I saw Albert and Morgana standing on stage, each holding a microphone, talking about their parenting experiences. Suddenly, I couldn't bring myself to move forward. People around me were whispering, commenting on how the child was so exceptional thanks to such highly educated parents. The couple looked so affectionate, and I heard someone say, Hey, isn't that Teacher H's wife? No, it must be Isolde from the cotton mill. Orion, who was backstage reciting his speech, spotted me and walked toward me with a frown. What are you doing here for my son's award ceremony? There's no need for you to stay. Go back quickly. You don't want people seeing you. It will cause trouble, he said. Standing there, seeing my son, who I had raised with so much effort, I was filled with emotions that I could not put into words. I felt like a fool, excitedly coming here only to leave in disappointment. Orion's teacher asked him who I was. Orion, looking distant, replied, A relative. The door opened, and Albert sat beside me speaking in a calm voice. Isolde, our son has achieved so much. He wants to share his joy with his mother. As parents, we shouldn't disappoint him. I didn't stop what I was doing, my hands still moving. I'm not his mother, I replied. Albert placed a hand on my shoulder. Stop being so stubborn. I know you're hurt, but they are your children. Finally, I looked at him and said, Albert, what makes you think that, even if I'm hurt, I will stay with you all? I'm just Isolde now, not anyone's wife or mother. From now on, I'll live for myself. Albert didn't respond, left speechless like a child. The following day, only Albert attended Orion's awards ceremony. When asked where his mother was, Orion's face darkened, and he didn't answer. Some classmates made cruel jokes, asking if his mother had abandoned him, since she didn't even come to such an important event. Orion, furious, punched one of the classmates, starting a fight. Morgana, who had come along to watch, was startled and tried to intervene. Stop! Stop fighting! She cried. But Orion, still no match for the stronger classmate, was soon pinned to the ground and beaten. You're not my mother! Orion shouted. My mother's just unwell and recovering. I watched silently from the room. Orion beat the classmate until he was bleeding, his face bruised and swollen. The classmate's parents, furious, came to me demanding an explanation. Cass Aya quickly stepped forward and said, Mom, that kid said we don't have a mother and that you don't want us anymore. That's why Orion fought him. I rubbed my temples and looked at Albert, who stood there silent. You handle it yourself, I muttered as I turned to leave. Cass Aya grabbed my hand. Mom, do you really not want us anymore? She asked. Looking at Cass Aya, who had been raised to be graceful but spoiled, I remembered how she had once suggested that I divorce Albert to make way for Morgana. She had spoken many hurtful words to me. "Issa, you don't deserve to be my mother. Please divorce Dad. Mom and Dad love each other so much. They fell in love first. Why did you come later and take Dad's place? You're shameless." I glanced at Orion, who had grown tall and handsome. He had been successful, but since childhood, he had rejected me as his mother. Due to his dislike, the villagers had also disrespected me, and I had suffered from public judgment and emotional abuse. I had even suffered a mental breakdown and once jumped from a building, but I didn't die. Eventually, Orion married Morgana's daughter and walked into the wedding hall without even sending me an invitation. Albert rushed back, looking pleadingly at me. He wasn't afraid of my biting words, but of how they might affect the children. I slowly pulled my fingers out of Cass Aya's grip. "I don't want you anymore. I'm not your mother." Orion's eyes widened in anger, and Cass Aya broke into loud sobs. Albert didn't even deserve my attention. Only when fate struck their hearts did they feel the pain. After recovering my health, I felt free to leave. I baked a pan of pancakes and packed my things. The suitcase held 2 sets of clothes, a bank book, my ID card, and the pancakes. Albert, who had gone out to buy pork, returned to find me zipping up my luggage. He forced a smile. "Isolde, should I make your favorite braised pork today? It'll be quick." He walked toward me, and the sunlight bathed me, casting a golden glow around me. Albert, his voice trembling, gently stroked my white hair and said, "Isolde, you've worked so hard these years. You even have white hairs now." I turned to face him. "Yes, being your wife and the mother of a Cass Aya and Orion was too hard." Albert sighed deeply. "Isolde, can I hug you one last time?" I looked at him with red eyes. He opened his arms slightly, but I took a step back and calmly refused. "No need. Let's part on good terms." I sat on the green train to Nchang, holding my divorce papers with a red cover. Looking out the window at the passing scenery, I felt a sense of finality. I felt as if even the shortness of breath in my chest had eased. To the villagers, it must have seemed like I, who had been so harsh and envious, was now willing to let go of Albert, who was bound to achieve great success and 2 exceptional children. They must have thought I was out of my mind. But that wasn't true. It was me, hiding in the room again and again, gritting my teeth to suppress my sobs. I was determined to live my own life, to focus solely on myself. There was a knock on the door, and Secretary Linda opened it, informing me that Mr. Hu was waiting for me in the reception room. I looked up from my computer screen and nodded. 10 years had passed, enough time for many things to change. I had come from nothing, from a small village, and fought my way through the business world to reach the place I was now. Orion, exceptionally bright, managed to leave his hometown through his own hard work. After graduating, he started a business with his classmates and made a name for himself. As we sat face to face, I reviewed his partnership proposal. "Sorry, Mr. Hu, but this proposal doesn't meet my expectations. Perhaps we can collaborate in the future." I offered him a friendly and confident smile. Orion's eyes reddened and his lips quivered. "Okay," he said, standing up. But his next words made me pause. "President Isolde, my father passed away just a day before yesterday." I glanced back at him, offering my condolences. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, then opened the door and left without looking back. Orion buried his face in his hands, his back shaking. The news of his father's death didn't affect me much, though. That night, as I gazed at the lights of the tall buildings from below, I felt a tinge of sentimentality. I, Isolde, had no regrets. I didn't regret loving Albert, nor did I regret leaving him. After 10 years of fighting for power and money in the business world, I now valued those things far more than the feelings of love or hate. Extra chapter from Albert's perspective. At the Civil Affairs Bureau, when Isolde received the divorce certificate, a smile of relief crossed her face. I looked at this woman, worn down by the years and family life, and felt a deep sadness. Isolde, as long as you turn around, I'll always be right behind you. She looked at me directly. Albert, I won't make the same mistake again. Don't make it seem like I was blind. My pain came from all of you. If you don't water a sapling, how can it survive? Her words struck me again and again. I opened my mouth but couldn't find anything to say. She was right. I hadn't fulfilled my role as a husband. I hadn't raised our children properly. And I had made a mess of our marriage. I watched her board the bus, the dust clouding my eyes, and then my face was covered with tears. When I arrived home, the children had returned from school. Cass Aya asked, Dad, where is she? Orion answered, She must have gone off to slack off again. Come on, let's do our homework, he added, but then looked at me in confusion. For the first time, I lost my temper with them. She's your mother. She gave birth to you and raised you for 15 years. Why do you always have such mean thoughts about her? Why say such cruel things? They trembled at my outburst. Orion asked, confused, Dad, what's wrong? Did something happen to her? I slumped down on the stone at the door, my eyes red. Ayla has left, and she'll never come back. She should have left long ago, with a husband like me and children like you. Cass Aya burst into tears. You're lying. She's always been so worried about us. How could she leave? I'm going to find her. Orion seemed struck by lightning, not fully grasping what I had said. Morgana, who had been waiting outside, walked in at that moment. Albert, don't be too sad. You still have me, she said. I looked at her and suddenly laughed. What a calculating woman. Why did it take me this long to see it? Get out. I have nothing to do with you from now on. Morgana turned around, attempting to comfort Cass Aya. Don't cry, Cass Aya. Auntie will take care of you from now on. Orion pushed her away. Get out of my house. It's all your fault. You're the one who drove my mother away. Morgana staggered back in surprise and showed her true colors. She turned to me and threatened, If you don't take responsibility for me, I'll report you to the school. I looked at her wearily. This was the woman I had cared for from childhood to middle age. She was beautiful, well-maintained, and always pretended to be considerate. She was nothing like Isolde, but I had been so blind that I had chosen the wrong one. Do whatever you want. I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Morgana left angrily. Soon after, the school issued a severe reprimand, and I was suspended for a long period. The children became quiet, and it seemed that overnight they had matured. Cass Aya occasionally asked, Will Mum come back? Won't she come back, even if I am obedient? At times like this, Orion would also look at me with expectation. I distanced myself from them. The first lesson in life is not to let true feelings slip away, and this became my first lesson. I used to think I was knowledgeable, but I hadn't taken true feelings seriously before. I never remarried, and did my best to raise the two children well. Looking at their excellent report cards, I felt deeply satisfied. Look, Aoda, our children might be as successful as you in the future, I thought. For every awards ceremony I attended alone, but I thought she was more suited to be there than I was. 10 years passed quickly. When I was younger, I immersed myself in teaching, working tirelessly day and night. Later, as I grew older, my energy faded and my health declined. I lived in memories, missing Isolde very much. My son, who had done well for himself, bought me an LCD TV. I suffered from presbyopia, and the large screen helped me see faces clearly. I watched Isolde on TV. She was so vibrant and full of life, and leaving this failed marriage had seemed like a new beginning for her. I had let her down so much, so I never allowed myself or the children to disturb her life. On the Mid-Autumn Festival, Orion and Cass Aya both asked for leave and came home to keep me company. I was watching a solemn interview on TV when suddenly I felt sleepy. As the roosters crowed in the yard, I closed my eyes. Slowly, the sobs and cries of my children filled the air. I saw the youngest Isolde looking at me shyly and saying, "If you're not good to me, I'll leave you." I whispered, "I'm sorry, Isolde. I'm such a jerk."